Harold Davenport was the kind of man the tabloids loved to hate, handsome, wealthy, and never without a scandal. But no one ever expected this particular drama to unfold in the glare of high society's most exclusive restaurant, especially not with his pregnant wife sobbing in the middle of it all. In just one heated moment, Harold shattered more than expensive dinnerware when he delivered a stinging slap across Evelyn's face. Witnesses stood frozen cell phones out, capturing every angle of the betrayal. Within hours, the video went viral, thrusting Harold and the secrets he'd worked so hard to hide straight into the spotlight. Harold Davenport prided himself on two things: his ability to close any business deal and his impeccable public persona. If you walked into the towering glass building that housed Davenport Investments, you'd be greeted by smiling receptionists, crisp-suited assistants, and a portrait of Harold himself that exuded both charm and power. Behind the scenes, he navigated labyrinthine deals with an iron will. He had started from modest beginnings, something he rarely shared openly, to become the city's most lauded real estate mogul. His name peppered the society pages alongside glamorous photos of his equally sophisticated wife, Evelyn Davenport. They appeared to be the epitome of a power couple. Her shining brown eyes and perfectly styled hair spoke of poise and grace, the essential ingredients for playing the role of a millionaire's wife in high society. She was not just a trophy by any means. Evelyn held a master's degree in art history and curated exhibitions for a local gallery. Yet to the outside world, she seemed a mere ornament to Harold's unstoppable ambitions. Harold considered himself unstoppable until recently. He had just received news that Evelyn was pregnant. The idea of fatherhood was supposed to fill him with pride and joy. Instead, it felt like an inconvenient sidetrack to his grander life plan. Children meant cutting down on the lavish parties, the adventurous getaways, and the provocative dinners that often involved far more than just food. On top of that, business had been rocky for the past 6 months. Some said the real estate bubble in certain parts of the city was bursting and Harold was feeling the tremors. But he refused to show weakness. He doubled down on new developments, ignoring the warnings of colleagues. He had built an empire. How could it possibly crumble? Evelyn Davenport stared at the ultrasound photos pinned to her dresser mirror every morning. She was enamored with the tiny life growing inside her, but an undercurrent of dread also ran through her thoughts. Her marriage had once been built on genuine affection, but in recent months, Harold had grown distant. He'd come home late without explanation, skip important doctor appointments, and at times displayed a temper she'd never witnessed in their earlier years. She confided in her best friend, Fiona Bradford, who came from old money and spent her days juggling charity events. Fiona often told her, "Men like Harold are under immense pressure. Try to be more understanding." Evelyn did try. She planned romantic dinners, arranged quiet nights by the fireplace, and even suggested couples therapy. But Harold always brushed her off with a dismissive wave or an outright snub. This pregnancy, though a miracle to her, seemed to irritate Harold in a way she couldn't fully fathom. He was curt whenever she mentioned baby names or asked if he'd help decorate the nursery. Evelyn began taking notes on her phone of every small moment of love he did show, as though hoarding them like rare jewels, holding on to evidence that the man she married still existed. Complicating things further was the swirl of rumors she caught drifting through the city's upper crust. A mistress, some whispered. Others said they'd seen him at questionable venues late at night. She tried to remain hopeful, to keep faith in the vow they had shared. After all, this was the man who'd once whisked her away for a spontaneous trip to Santorini just to watch the sunset on her birthday. Yet she couldn't deny the gnawing feeling in her stomach that something was terribly wrong. Serafina Rossetti was everything a scandalous mistress might be, statuesque, captivating, and dangerously ambitious. She had grown up on the outskirts of Rome, clawing her way out of poverty by using her wit charm and an unrelenting will to transcend her circumstances. Arriving in the city with no connections, she landed a job as a lounge singer in a high-end hotel bar frequented by the wealthy. That's where she first caught Harold's eye. Harold was drawn to Serafina's exotic accent and the allure of the unknown. As her smoky voice caressed the final note of a song, one evening Harold found himself enthralled. He approached her with the confidence of a man used to getting what he wanted. Serafina recognized him immediately. The local tabloids were filled with stories of Harold Davenport, the man who could turn a patch of barren land into a sprawling, money-making enterprise. She pretended not to care about his reputation or fortune, knowing full well how to play the game. Before long, they were meeting in clandestine hotel suites. Harold felt a rush with Serafina that had been absent from his marriage for far too long, at least in his mind. She was exciting and adventurous, feeding his ego in ways he didn't realize he craved. She would whisper how powerful he was, how unstoppable, and how much she admired him. It filled a void he had never acknowledged existed. To Serafina, Harold was a ticket to stability, and possibly much more. She knew the stakes. If she played her cards correctly, she might secure a future that far outshone her modest singing gigs. She feigned ignorance about his personal life, though she followed every development on social media. She told herself that if Harold was unhappy in his marriage, it was his problem to fix. She was simply the prize he deserved. The night it all came crashing down began as an extravagant date at La Belle Étoile, the city's most exclusive French restaurant. It was a place known for its crystal chandeliers, velvet drapes, and a menu that could make even the most seasoned gourmet swoon. Reservations were nearly impossible to procure. Harold, of course, knew the owner personally and had a private table set aside a lavish corner draped in gold and burgundy, offering both seclusion and prestige. He arrived with Serafina on his arm, and heads turned immediately. She wore an emerald green silk gown that clung to her every curve, while Harold's tailored tux was impeccable. Waiters swooned with deference. The wine steward promptly arrived with an imported bottle of Chateau Margaux vintage 1982, which Harold had pre-ordered at an astronomical price. Serafina loved the attention. She let out a seductive laugh at every mundane remark Harold made, batting her eyelashes as though he were reciting poetry. Little did she know that someone had recognized them. A discreet text was sent, and within minutes gossip started circulating through the upper echelons of the city's social network. Meanwhile, Evelyn sat at home, rubbing her growing belly, wondering yet again why Harold was working so late. She had made calls to the office, but each time an apologetic assistant told her, "Mr. Davenport is still in a meeting." When her phone pinged with a message from an acquaintance that read, "I think you need to see this accompanied by a grainy photo of Harold and another woman at La Belle Étoile." Evelyn felt her world tilt. Fueled by adrenaline heartbreak and a sense of determination she didn't know she possessed, Evelyn decided she had to see for herself. She hailed a car, ignoring her better judgment and every instinct telling her to stay home. She headed straight for the restaurant, tears threatening to spill from her eyes as she clutched her phone to her chest. When Evelyn arrived at La Belle Étoile, her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear the maitre d' asking for her reservation. She spotted Harold almost immediately across the dimly lit room. He was laughing, his face turned toward Serafina. For a moment, Evelyn couldn't breathe. It felt surreal, like a nightmare that stubbornly refused to end. She managed to slip past the staff, fueled by raw emotion. She stood trembling at the edge of the table. Her presence was so unexpected that Harold didn't notice her at first. Serafina, however, lifted her eyes and froze. The expression on her face transitioned from smug delight to startled anxiety in a split second. Harold finally caught on. His laughter died, and a hush fell over their little corner of the restaurant. By now, curious diners at nearby tables were craning their necks to see the source of the disruption. Evelyn Harold said, his voice taut, "What are you doing here?" She couldn't quite form coherent words. Her throat felt like sandpaper as she uttered, "So this is how you spend your late nights." Before Harold could respond, Serafina tried to stand, but Evelyn's fierce gaze made her retreat into her seat. Evelyn didn't notice the staff edging closer to intervene or the scattered camera phones that rose from various tables. She only had eyes for Harold, whose face was now marked by anger more than guilt. Seeing the confrontation escalate, the maitre d' approached gently. "Madame, if there's an issue, stay out of this." Harold barked, eyes locked on Evelyn. Tension twisted in the air as onlookers waited, half in dread, half in voyeuristic fascination. Evelyn's hands shook, not with fear, but with a mix of betrayal and heartbreak she could no longer contain. No one could have predicted how swiftly the situation would spiral. Evelyn, tears brimming, whispered, "How could you do this?" "You know I'm pregnant, Harold. I'm carrying your child." Her voice cracked on the last word. Harold looked around painfully, aware that all eyes were on him. The empire he had carefully built on a foundation of public relations and polished appearances now stood on the brink of collapse. In his mind, Evelyn was violating the unspoken rule that all dirty laundry must remain hidden. She had broken the illusion he had painstakingly maintained, and for that, a flicker of rage ignited in him. It was a single impulsive motion. Harold raised his arm and delivered a stinging slap across Evelyn's cheek. The crack of his hand against her skin echoed in the hushed restaurant, shocking everyone into stillness. Evelyn stumbled back, her hand flying to her burning cheek, eyes wide in disbelief and pain. Serafina gasped, and several diners let out shocked cries. One or two even scrambled to stop him, but it was too late. The deed was done. As Evelyn steadied herself, the horrifying reality sank in. She was pregnant, vulnerable, and had just been struck by the man she once believed would protect her from all harm. Then the chaotic aftermath began. Concerned patrons rushed forward, some filming on their phones. A couple of women attempted to console Evelyn, while others shouted at Harold, calling him out for his abuse. Restaurant security threatened to call the police, but Harold, with his connections, somehow dodged immediate trouble. He stood rooted as if he couldn't quite comprehend what he'd done. Serafina was pulling at his arm, begging him to leave before the authorities arrived. Evelyn, tears streaming down her face, could hardly breathe. Her cheek throbbed, and her entire world felt as if it had collapsed in a single slap. The viral storm began even before the night was over. Multiple videos from different angles found their way onto social media platforms: Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. Within hours, Harold Davenport was trending, accompanied by hashtags like Justice for Evelyn and Stop Domestic Abuse. The public reaction was swift and merciless. Even those who had never heard of Harold Davenport before chimed in, condemning his actions as monstrous. By morning, local news channels picked up the story. Cynthia Morgan, a well-known news anchor, opened the day's broadcast with the scandalous footage. Experts chimed in, psychologists discussing domestic violence, lawyers speculating on potential legal consequences, and business analysts predicting the downfall of Davenport investments. If there was any doubt that Harold's reputation would weather this storm, it was erased by the sheer volume of denunciation flooding every media outlet. Evelyn, meanwhile, had spent a sleepless night at her friend Fiona's house. She found no peace there, either her phone vibrating constantly with messages of sympathy, outrage, and offers for legal counsel. Paparazzi were already camping out near the gates, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. It was surreal watching her private pain turned into a public spectacle. Harold woke up to a house that felt empty despite its opulence. News vans crowded the street outside his mansion. Every attempt he made to contact Evelyn was met with silence. Even Serafina tried to call him several times, leaving frantic voicemails, but he ignored them. Harold's PR team scrambled to manage the crisis, urging him to issue a statement apologizing for his actions and expressing contrition. But Harold was too proud and perhaps too shocked to act rationally. He believed he could ride out the storm, just as he had navigated countless controversies before. Late that same day, Harold received the dreaded official notice he was summoned to appear in court the very next morning. It was no longer a matter of social media backlash or public perception. Now he faced real legal consequences. The charge was assault on his pregnant wife, no less. The severity of such an act was enough for the district attorney's office to take immediate action. Bernard Stein, a high-profile defense attorney on Harold's payroll, rushed over to the Davenport mansion as soon as he heard the news. Stein had seen his fair share of celebrity and high society cases, but even he seemed rattled. In the gleaming marble foyer, he told Harold in no uncertain terms, "The footage is everywhere. We can try damage control, but you must appear remorseful and cooperative in court. This isn't a tabloid rumor we can simply squash." Harold seethed at this notion of having to grovel. "I built this empire," he snapped, pacing restlessly, "and I'll be damned if I let it crumble because of one slip. Evelyn. She provoked me. She showed up uninvited, made a scene." Stein cut him off. "Do you hear yourself? That is not a defense. You slapped her. And she's pregnant. The public outcry alone is enough to doom you if we don't handle this very, very carefully." He stressed again the importance of a heartfelt apology, possibly even a settlement, anything to prevent a drawn-out criminal trial. Reluctantly, Harold agreed to follow Stein's guidance, but he refused to see Evelyn or even attempt a direct apology. Pride and anger still clouded his judgment, overshadowing any rational thought. His mind whirled with blame and resentment for Evelyn, for the diners who had filmed him, even for Serafina, whose presence had set the stage for the entire spectacle. While Harold prepared his defensive strategy, Evelyn faced a far more tumultuous emotional storm. She was holed up in Fiona's guest room, drifting between tearful breakdowns and bouts of numbness. Her cheek still bore a faint bruise, and every time she glimpsed her reflection, she felt a jolt of anguish mixed with disbelief. When she placed a hand over her belly, she worried not just for her own future, but for the innocent child growing inside her. Through the door, Fiona tried to coax her with tea-soft music or heartfelt reassurances. Evelyn appreciated the support, but she felt trapped in a nightmare she never asked for. A flurry of phone calls from advocacy groups, lawyers, and journalists only added to the confusion. While some demanded she press charges and make a public statement, others urged her to remember that Harold was a powerful man with the means to retaliate. Even her own parents, who lived in another state, left voicemails begging her to come home away from the media frenzy. Eventually, Evelyn allowed Fiona to connect her with a legal advocate named Janet Morales, who specialized in domestic violence cases. Janet arrived at Fiona's house, a calm, steady presence in the midst of chaos. She explained the legal options available to Evelyn, from restraining orders to possible civil suits. Evelyn listened quietly, feeling the weight of the decisions she needed to make. Her mind wandered to the early days of her relationship with Harold, their honeymoon in Bali, the nights they spent dreaming about their future, the moment they decided to try for a child. Each memory felt like a shard of broken glass, once whole and dazzling, now painful and scattered. Still, a determination flickered in her eyes. She wasn't just a victim. She was a mother, and she needed to protect herself and her unborn child, even if it meant taking the man she once loved to court. The next morning, the courthouse was abuzz with reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers. Police barricades lined the steps leading to the main entrance, where a swarm of media personnel jockeyed for the best vantage point. When Harold arrived in his sleek black sedan, he was greeted with an onslaught of camera flashes and shouted questions. Dressed in a tailored grey suit and dark sunglasses, he wore a stoic mask that revealed no hint of emotion. Inside the courtroom was surprisingly small and modest for such a high-profile case. The wooden pews filled with press and spectators. Evelyn and her lawyer Janet were seated at the prosecution's table. She looked pale and fragile, her eyes downcast, but there was a certain resolve in her posture. Harold glanced at her only briefly as he took his seat beside Bernard Stein. Judge Mary Kingsley presided, an astute woman known for her intolerance of theatrics. She addressed Harold's legal counsel, who motioned for a plea of not guilty. The charges read aloud included felony assault and battery on a pregnant spouse. The words echoed ominously through the hushed room. Prosecutor James Underwood wasted no time presenting the video evidence that had already become infamous. The room fell silent as the footage played. There on the screen was Harold's hand connecting sharply with Evelyn's cheek, her face contorted in pain, the restaurant crowd gasping in the background. Harold swallowed hard, but his expression remained guarded. His attorney argued that it was an isolated incident, fueled by extreme emotional stress, an out-of-character moment for a man who had led a charitable, community-minded life. The prosecution countered that domestic violence could never be excused by stress, especially when an unborn child was at risk. By the time the hearing concluded, it was clear there would be no quick resolution. Trial was set for several weeks later, and the tension in the courtroom felt like a coiled spring about to snap. In the days following the court hearing, Serafina Rossetti found herself in an awkward position. She had assumed that Harold needing her emotional support would whisk her away from the scandal and set her up in some plush hideaway. Instead, she found her calls unanswered or curtly dismissed. The few times Harold did speak to her, he was terse and irritable, as though she were now a complication rather than a thrilling escape. Serafina had her own problems too. Reporters had begun staking out the upscale condo Harold had rented for her. Some tabloids ran sensational headlines like, "The Other Woman." Serafina Rossetti speaks out. Even though she had given no interviews, offers from less reputable media outlets poured in, all wanting her exclusive story. Serafina sensed an opportunity. Perhaps if Harold was going to turn cold, she could profit from this mess in her own way. Despite her interest in monetizing the scandal, Serafina also harbored a flicker of concern for Evelyn. She never anticipated the situation would escalate into physical violence. Yes, she had wanted to supplant Evelyn as the woman in Harold's life, but witnessing a man strike his pregnant wife had jarred her. For the first time, she wondered if she was in over her head. One evening, she decided to contact Evelyn anonymously. She sent a brief, cryptic message. "I'm sorry for what happened. I never wanted it to come to this." She then quickly blocked the number, unsure of why she felt compelled to do so in the first place. That night, she remained awake, perched on her leather sofa, staring at the city lights outside her window. She had spent a lifetime fighting for a better existence, convinced that the ends justified the means. But as she peered into her own future, she suddenly realized she might be standing on a precarious tightrope, one misstep away from losing everything. Harold Davenport's PR team had never faced a crisis of this magnitude. Usually they managed to paint him as a charitable businessman, someone who hosted lavish galas for hospitals, sponsored educational programs, and revitalized run-down neighborhoods. But the video of him striking Evelyn was impossible to spin. The public condemnation was fierce, and major corporate partners began distancing themselves. Stock in Davenport Investments took a nosedive. Shareholders were panicking, and the board of directors discreetly questioned Harold's ability to continue leading the company. Not one to accept defeat, quietly Harold held a meeting in his opulent office suite. The walls were lined with modern art, each piece meticulously chosen to convey sophistication. But on this day, the art's tranquility did nothing to calm the anxieties in the room. Board members, anxious and distrustful, demanded reassurance. Harold paced at the head of the long, polished table, trying to maintain composure. "We need to control the narrative," he insisted. "I've directed my lawyers to talk settlement with Evelyn. We can handle this quietly if she—" One of the older board members, James Chapman, interrupted. "Harold, with all due respect, you assaulted your pregnant wife on camera. There's no controlling that narrative, and if we don't distance ourselves, we risk the downfall of the entire firm." Murmurs of agreement echoed around the table. Harold's jaw tightened. He insisted that the scandal would blow over if they remained united. But the board members exchanged doubtful glances. In the hallways outside, staff whispered uncertain if they'd have a job in a few months. That evening, Harold retreated to his penthouse office. The city skyline spread before him. He clutched a glass of expensive scotch, staring at the reflection of a man he hardly recognized. His empire was teetering, and for the first time in his life, he had no idea how to save it. As Harold's world collapsed, the people in his orbit took sides. A handful of his longtime associates tried to stand by him, offering moral support and private sympathies. Most, however, withdrew out of self-preservation. Invitations to elite events dried up. Charity galas quietly removed his name from the guest lists, and those who once clamored for a seat at his table now avoided him. Evelyn, too, witnessed a shift in her social circle. Friends who had previously envied her lifestyle now reached out with genuine compassion, offering everything from free daycare advice to assistance in navigating the legal system. Fiona remained steadfast, becoming Evelyn's de facto bodyguard against paparazzi and meddling reporters. Meanwhile, the press had a field day, highlighting every single detail of Harold and Evelyn's life. Newspapers dug into Harold's financial dealings, revealing questionable partnerships and uncompleted real estate ventures. Speculative pieces claimed Davenport Investments was on the brink of bankruptcy. Journalists camped outside Fiona's suburban estate, snapping photos through telephoto lenses whenever Evelyn ventured outdoors for a doctor's appointment or a walk. Harold was enraged by the intrusion, even though he had no moral ground to stand on. In a rare moment of vulnerability, he asked Bernard Stein, "Is there any chance Evelyn will drop the charges?" Stein's expression was grim. "She's pressing forward, And the DA's office has ample evidence. If it goes to trial, you could face jail time, especially considering the severity of hitting a pregnant woman. Faced with the real possibility of incarceration, Harold felt the first tremors of fear. He was used to controlling everything. His company, his reputation, his personal relationships. But now the grip he had on his world was slipping, and all he could do was watch it fall. Evelyn spent her days juggling medical checkups with legal consultations. The unborn child remained her top priority, and each ultrasound brought both hope and anxiety. Would the baby sense the stress roiling through her? She tried to soothe her mind with prenatal yoga recommended by her therapist. The sessions offered brief respite, but the looming trial kept her nerves on edge. Her therapist, Dr. Anita Green, encouraged her to confront not just the slap, but all the emotional abuse and neglect she'd experienced in the marriage. In one session, Evelyn sobbed as she recounted the nights she would wait hours on end for Harold to return home, only to be met with indifference or scorn. She realized that the violent act at La Belle Étoile was just the tip of a dangerous iceberg, and recognizing this made her simultaneously furious and fearful. Meanwhile, Harold's lawyers tried multiple strategies, proposing a private reconciliation, dangling a generous financial settlement, and even floating the idea of joint public statements about marital discord. Each offer was swiftly rejected. Evelyn was no longer the timid spouse who would do anything to keep the peace. The baby changed everything for her, instilling a fierce resolve to ensure a better future, free from deceit and fear. Late at night, Evelyn lay awake in Fiona's guest bed, replaying the slap in her mind. She saw Harold's eyes burning with rage, felt the sting on her cheek anew. For the first time, she truly comprehended the fragility of her own existence and her child's. She had loved Harold once deeply, but she couldn't excuse what he'd done. In that dark stillness, she resolved to see this through to the end, no matter how daunting the road might be. As the trial date approached, both sides engaged in a flurry of legal maneuvers. Bernard Stein filed motions to suppress certain witness testimonies and to dispute the chain of custody for the restaurant video. The prosecution, led by James Underwood, countered with motions of their own, seeking to highlight Harold's history of emotional neglect and to call Serafina Rossetti as a witness. Serafina found herself in a precarious position. She had no desire to appear in court, especially knowing that the defense would paint her as a gold-digging mistress. Yet she also sensed an opportunity to exact some form of revenge on Harold for discarding her so callously once the scandal erupted. After consulting with a lawyer of her own, Serafina begrudgingly agreed to cooperate with the prosecution's subpoena. The court of public opinion, however, was far swifter. The tabloids labeled Serafina as a home wrecker and the vamp who lured Harold astray. Commentators on morning talk shows debated whether she deserved blame or sympathy. Serafina found the sudden fame both alluring and terrifying, as she realized her once private life was now fodder for gossip and judgment. Inside Davenport Investments, the board of directors held emergency sessions without Harold. Rumors circulated about a possible ousting. Harold heard whispers about a management shakeup that would remove him as CEO. Each time the rumor reached him, it fanned the flames of his anger. He felt betrayed by the very people who had benefited from his leadership for years. Still, he clung to the hope that the trial might reveal the situation as a one-time lapse in judgment, at least enough to salvage what remained of his empire. But in his darkest moments, he wondered if the unstoppable Harold Davenport was truly unstoppable after all. Amid the swirling chaos, Evelyn received unexpected support from a group called Women First, a local non-profit dedicated to assisting victims of domestic violence. Organized by a determined activist named Sarah Hernandez, they reached out to Evelyn, offering counseling, legal resources, and even security if she felt threatened. Though initially wary of involving outsiders, Evelyn discovered a comforting sense of solidarity in their presence. Harold, in a rare moment of contrition, attempted to send Evelyn a bouquet of white roses and a handwritten note saying, "For the sake of our child, let's find a peaceful resolution." Evelyn never responded. She handed the note to her lawyer, who added it to the growing file of communications, unsure if it might be a ploy to manipulate the legal proceedings. Around the same time, a former employee of Davenport Investments named Marcus Lee came forward sharing that Harold had once verbally abused him in a private meeting. Marcus provided an affidavit describing Harold as a tyrant prone to explosive temper tantrums whenever challenged. While this testimony wasn't directly linked to Evelyn's assault, it added to the damning portrait of a man with little regard for those around him. Evelyn started to wonder if she ever truly knew Harold at all. She had been entranced by his charm, his success, and the beautiful life he offered. Perhaps she had been just another piece in his carefully curated public image. This realization fueled her resolve for justice. She began to understand that the trial was about more than just a single slap. It was about holding Harold accountable for a pattern of abuse. Late at night, she wrote in her journal, "I'm not fighting just for me. I'm fighting for every woman who's been silenced by fear, every child who deserves a loving home, and the future I want for my baby." The courtroom buzzed like a hive on the first morning of the trial. Long before the doors opened, reporters crowded the courthouse steps, their breath fogging in the early morning chill. News vans lined the curb like battle tanks, their antennas pointed to the sky. Inside every seat was filled lawyers, journalists, court staff, and a few silent strangers who just wanted to witness a man of power finally face justice. Evelyn sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture dignified but tense. She wore a simple navy dress and minimal makeup. She didn't need embellishment. The faint bruise along her jaw had faded, but the memory it carried still throbbed beneath the surface. Her lawyer, Janet Morales, sat beside her, focused, calm, and determined. Across the room, Harold Davenport entered, flanked by Bernard Stein and a second attorney. His navy suit was crisp, his hair carefully styled, but he looked thinner than before, his jaw tighter, his eyes a shade duller. The cameras had captured his fall from grace for weeks, but here under oath, there would be no curated image, only truth. Judge Mary Kingsley entered promptly, the courtroom rising in unison. She surveyed the room with a cool, measured gaze before nodding to the attorneys. "Let us begin. James Underwood." The prosecutor stood and launched into a piercing opening statement. "This case is not about business. It's not about society pages or philanthropy. It's about a woman, a wife, struck in public while pregnant. It's about a man who believed his wealth would shield him from consequence. But in this courtroom, we are all equal under the law." His words settled into the silence like weights dropped into water. When Stein took his turn, his tone was somber. "Davenport is not a monster. He's a man under immense pressure who made a terrible mistake. We will show that this was an isolated incident, not a pattern. A moment of emotional failure, not cruelty." The real moment began when Evelyn was called to the stand. She walked slowly, every step echoing in the wood-paneled chamber. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore the oath, and sat down, clutching a tissue in her lap. Underwood guided her through the beginning, her marriage, the pregnancy, and the night of the incident. I walked into the restaurant, Evelyn said, her voice low but steady, and saw my husband laughing with another woman. I was humiliated. But more than that, I was scared. Scared because when I confronted him, he didn't apologize. He hit me. She paused, blinking back tears. It wasn't just the slap. It was the way he looked at me. Like I was the problem. Like I deserved it. The jury sat motionless. Some jurors looked at her with open empathy. Others scribbled quietly. During cross-examination, Stein treaded carefully. Mrs. Davenport, would you say your marriage had challenges before this night? Evelyn nodded. All marriages do. But challenges don't excuse violence. Stein pressed further, attempting to imply her presence at the restaurant was confrontational. You showed up uninvited, emotional upset. Is it possible things escalated too quickly? Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't even hesitate. That was not escalation. That was a choice. Silence followed. Even Stein backed off, realizing he was dangerously close to pushing the jury the wrong way. As court adjourned for the day, Fiona met Evelyn in the hallway and wrapped her arms around her. You did it, she whispered. You told the truth. Reporters leaned over the barricades, microphones extended, but Evelyn kept her eyes on the door ahead. She hadn't walked out with justice yet, but she had walked in with courage. And that was the first step in reclaiming her story. The second day of trial began under a grey, unsettled sky. Inside the courthouse, a palpable sense of anticipation gripped every corner. Reporters lined the marble steps outside, speculating on what might come next. Everyone was talking about the witness expected to take the stand, Serafina Rossetti. She arrived at the courthouse in a dark sedan with tinted windows. Gone were the plunging necklines and camera-ready smiles. Today, Serafina wore a sleek black dress with long sleeves and her hair pulled back into a tight bun. The look was deliberate, composed, restrained, almost somber. The court bailiff led her through the back entrance, but not before a few quick shutter clicks from alert photographers caught her profile. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. As Serafina walked down the aisle to the witness stand, Evelyn kept her gaze straight ahead, jaw tight. Fiona, seated beside her, offered a comforting squeeze of the hand. Across the room, Harold shifted in his seat, eyes unreadable. Prosecutor James Underwood began slowly. Ms. Rossetti, thank you for being here. Could you tell the court how you first met Mr. Davenport? Serafina's voice was low but clear. We met at the Grand Regent Hotel lounge. I was singing at the piano bar. He approached me after my set. And when did the relationship become romantic? Serafina hesitated. A few weeks later, he said he was unhappy in his marriage. I believed him. The gallery murmured. Underwood pressed gently. Can you describe Harold's demeanor during your time together? He was intense, controlling in subtle ways, but also charming. He made grand gestures, lavish dinners, gifts, but when things didn't go his way, his temper flared. She glanced briefly at Harold, especially the night at La Belle Étoile. Underwood nodded. Can you describe what you witnessed that night? Serafina inhaled. He was already tense before Evelyn arrived. He called her names, said she was always nagging him about the baby. When she showed up, he panicked. But what shocked me most was how quickly the slap came. 1 second, he was glaring. The next, he struck her. There was no hesitation. Gasps echoed through the room. Harold's eyes darkened, his jaw tight. Bernard Stein stood for cross-examination. Ms. Rossetti, he began coolly. How long have you known the prosecution intended to call you as a witness? A few weeks, she replied. During that time, did you speak to any media outlets? No. Did you consider selling your story? No, she said, a slight edge to her voice. But you must be aware that your name is now trending online. The mistress who helped take down Harold Davenport. That has value, does it not? Serafina didn't flinch. I didn't come here for value. I came to tell the truth. Isn't it true you continued seeing Mr. Davenport, even after knowing he was married? Yes, she said, her tone sharp now. But I never expected to witness violence. That changed everything. Stein backed off, sensing the jury was leaning toward her. She had delivered more than testimony. She had added depth to the prosecution's portrait of Harold as a man who didn't just lose his temper, but simmered with rage beneath the surface. Next came Marcus Lee, the former Davenport Investments employee. A young man in his early 30s, Marcus spoke with nervous energy. He recounted an incident where Harold screamed at him in a closed-door meeting and threatened to end his career over a missed contract clause. It was just paperwork, Marcus said, but he exploded. I walked out that day and never looked back. Though not directly tied to the incident, with Evelyn Marcus's account, bolstered the image of a man who used intimidation as a tool. By the end of day 2, the prosecution had laid out a pattern, not one of a single mistake, but of a man whose power insulated him from consequences until now. As the judge adjourned for the day, Evelyn caught Serafina's eye just briefly. For a fleeting second, there was no animosity between them, just the silent acknowledgement of a shared wound. By the 3rd day of trial, tension gripped the courtroom like a coiled spring. The prosecution had delivered a series of powerful testimonies, from Evelyn's haunting account to Serafina's damning implications, and now the defense was left with a singular risky strategy: put Harold on the stand. Bernard Stein wasn't fully confident in the decision, but Harold had insisted. He believed his voice could sway the jury, that his carefully practiced charm and narrative of stress and misjudgment might tilt the scales in his favor. After all, he had talked his way out of worse, or so he thought. The courtroom hushed as Harold rose, straightening his blazer and taking measured steps toward the witness box. The judge nodded. You may proceed. He took a breath and began. I grew up with nothing, Harold said, eyes flicking to the jury. A 1-bedroom apartment, a single mother who worked 2 jobs. I built everything I have through hard work and sacrifice. I've created homes for thousands, jobs for hundreds. I've supported charities, sponsored programs. My life has been about more than just profit. His voice was steady, each word calculated. But with success comes pressure. The past year has been overwhelming. Cracks in the company boardroom, betrayals, business partners fleeing. It felt like my world was slipping. I wasn't sleeping. I wasn't thinking clearly. That night, I snapped. He paused dramatically, letting the silence thicken. I never meant to hurt Evelyn. It was a moment of weakness. I regret it with every part of me. A murmur spread through the gallery. Some nodded sympathetically. Others remained unmoved, arms crossed, expressions stony. Then came the cross-examination. Prosecutor James Underwood stood, his tone clipped. Mr. Davenport, you described a moment of weakness. Do you believe pressure excuses striking your pregnant wife? Harold stiffened. I didn't say it excuses it. I said it explains it. Underwood's eyes narrowed. You were calm enough to order an expensive bottle of wine. You were composed enough to laugh with your mistress, to pose for photos. But when your wife appeared uninvited, as you put it, you lost control. Harold's face tightened. It wasn't just her presence. It was the scene she caused. She was confronting you, Underwood pressed, not for cheating, but for betraying the vows you made while carrying your child. Isn't it true you struck her not because of stress, but because she shattered your illusion of control? Objection. Overruled. Harold hesitated, clearly flustered. I felt cornered. Underwood stepped forward, voice firm. Do you understand the risk you posed that night? Not just to Evelyn, but to your unborn child. Had she fallen, hit her head, lost the baby, would it still have been a lapse? The room fell into complete stillness. Harold's throat bobbed. Of course not. I regret it. Regret doesn't erase action, Mr. Davenport, Underwood said sharply, especially when that action is a violent assault. Stein winced slightly from the defense table. Harold's carefully built narrative was unraveling under the prosecutor's precision. After stepping down, Harold returned to his seat, visibly shaken. He leaned toward Stein, whispering something urgent. But his attorney's silence spoke louder than words. The damage had been done. In an effort to salvage the moment, the defense presented a slideshow of Harold's philanthropic endeavors, ribbon cuttings, charity auctions, photos of him handing oversized checks to children's hospitals. But to the jury, these gestures felt disconnected, like hollow set pieces in a life too carefully staged. From the gallery, Evelyn watched quietly, her fingers resting on her belly. The man on the screen, the smiling public hero, was not the man who had slapped her in front of a room full of strangers, not the man who had abandoned her emotionally long before that night ever occurred. As the day ended, Judge Kingsley announced that closing arguments would be heard the following morning. The jury would soon render their verdict. Outside, cameras whirred and anchors rehearsed their lines. Inside, Harold Davenport sat still, staring straight ahead. For the first time, he looked like a man who didn't know what came next. The courtroom felt like a pressure chamber ready to burst. After 5 days of emotional testimony, war confessions, damning footage, and countless objections, the air was electric with anticipation. Every seat was filled, even the overflow rooms packed with journalists and spectators watching via monitors. Evelyn sat flanked by her attorney, Janet Morales, and Fiona, who gripped her hand tightly. Her breathing was slow, measured, her eyes distant, as if she were trying to float above the gravity of the moment. At the defense table, Harold sat unusually still. Gone was the arrogant tilt of his chin, the impervious glint in his eyes. His hands were folded tightly in his lap, fingers interlocked, knuckles pale. Bernard Stein leaned in and whispered something, but Harold gave no indication he'd heard. His gaze was locked forward, staring into a future he could no longer control. The jury filed in each face, solemn, many avoiding Harold's eyes. The foreperson, a woman in her 40s, with firm posture and a trembling sheet of paper in hand, stood at the judge's cue. In the case of the state versus Harold Davenport, she began, her voice slightly cracking under the weight of the moment. On the charge of felony assault on a pregnant spouse, we find the defendant guilty. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by stunned silence. Harold's body jolted, his shoulders dropping, as if the word had pierced something vital inside him. Stein placed a firm hand on his arm, a silent, grounding gesture. The weight of the verdict hung thick in the air. Judge Kingsley's gavel struck once, commanding attention. Sentencing will be scheduled in a separate hearing. Court is adjourned. As the room stirred back to life, murmurs, whispers, and camera clicks erupted like distant thunder. But Evelyn heard none of it. Her eyes welled with tears, a silent flood of emotion, too complex for words' relief, vindication, heartbreak, and grief all mingling at once. She pressed her hand to her belly, whispering a silent vow of safety and strength to the child within. Harold remained seated for a moment longer, staring blankly ahead. Then, as deputies approached to escort him out for legal processing, he finally turned. His eyes met Evelyn's across the room. They held each other's gaze for a beat, hers steady, unwavering, his clouded with disbelief, perhaps even sorrow. But no words passed between them. In that final glance, something unsaid passed, a recognition that everything they had built was gone, shattered by the strike of a hand and the unraveling of trust. Whatever future Harold imagined, it would no longer include control, reputation, or redemption on his terms. Outside the courthouse, the press surged forward, but Evelyn remained shielded by Janet and Fiona. Sarah Hernandez from Women First stood nearby, offering a warm, silent smile of support. Evelyn looked up at the sky, the sun breaking through a blanket of clouds, and for the first time in months, she exhaled without tension. She had done the unthinkable, stood up to a powerful man, not for revenge, but for her child, for herself, for every woman who had ever been told to stay silent. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, co-parenting, healing, rebuilding, it was hers to walk now free of fear. The verdict wasn't just a ruling, it was a rebirth. And so ends the saga of the millionaire whose pride and betrayal sparked a dramatic courtroom reckoning. Harold Davenport, once considered invincible, now faces the very real consequences of his choices. Meanwhile, Evelyn stands as a testament to courage, showing that even in the darkest hours, hope and justice can prevail. As she places a protective hand over her growing belly, she looks toward a future in which her child will never know the weight of fear or silence. If this story moved you, if you found yourself rooting for justice and resolution, please let us know by hitting the like button. Share it with your friends to spark important conversations about accountability and empathy. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more compelling tales that shine a light on the complexities of human relationships. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.